Hi, welcome to my presentation. I'm going to be talking about using identity as a lens for text-on-text academic writing. One particular conception of identity, not one that you've probably heard of because I don't think it's all that common. And then especially within academic writing classes in ESL, I've never seen anyone else using it, but I hope you'll think about it after watching this video. I'm going to divide the video into two halves. There's the first half, which is just about the lens, which is one researcher's attempt to conceptualize identity in a particular way. And then second half, applications for that lens in an academic writing class. And I use this lens because it's worked many, many times in the past in my classes, and I think it's very insightful. It leads to really interesting discussions with my students. It works as an application to real life, like they can use it to look at themselves and the people around them, and it always leads to some kind of interesting insight. And then also when applied to characters in a novel or a book or a story. It's also a useful exercise in academic jargon. Something that happens pretty often in ESL classes is students look up a word in the dictionary, and whatever's in the dictionary, that's what they think the word means. But a lot of academic language is not like that, especially in the realms of like psychology or communication, where a word can mean one thing amongst laymen, and I am a layman for the most part with regards to these subjects too, and then another thing within that field. So what a speech act is, well, that is my field, but what an identity is, what motivation means, what depression means, all of those mean something very different in their academic fields than they mean to most people and according to the dictionary. So identity defined more rigorously is a very good introduction to that whole idea that words have these second, much more technical and difficult meanings for most of our students when they get into their undergrad classes. They'll encounter that phenomenon many more times. And this lens is not very commonly used. I like it because it's unusual. Students have probably never heard of it. Even if it's their second or third time taking an ESL academic writing class at this level, they might have already read Power of Habit and Mindset and Grit, but not this one, probably. But I hope you'll think about using it in your classes after this presentation. So let me introduce the lens. It's the work of a psychologist named James Paul G. And he really laid it out clearly in this one article, whose title is right here. And I'm just going to give you like the elevator version of the definition from the first page of the article. When any human being acts and interacts in a given context, others recognize that person as acting and interacting as a certain, quote, kind of person, or even as several different, quote, kinds at once. There are a few things that are really important and possibly unintuitive about this definition that I want to go over in a little more detail. So first of all, G places the, I guess, ownership of identity in other people besides the person whose identity it is. So whatever your identity is, it's what other people think you are. That's according to G's definition. That's, for me, the one part of this conception of identity that makes it the most attractive and the most interesting. Your identity depends on being perceived by other people. And so it clashes with the common sense version of identity and the version that might be in your students' dictionaries, where they see it that an identity is something you carry around inside of you that you know about and maybe other people don't know about or other people can be wrong about. G's definition is different. He says the other people determine your identity, and whatever is secret about you that you know and don't share with others is not part of your identity. You know, again, in this definition of identity. So a secret identity like Superman's secret identity as Clark Kent or some guy at Comic-Con is an oxymoron. You can't have a secret identity because it, by definition, depends on other people recognizing you. Okay, so also, as a certain kind of person. So what kinds of people there are depends on who's perceiving you. A person can't perceive you as a kind of person where the definition of that kind of person is unavailable to them, right? So the kinds of people that you can be depend on the culture that you're living in and who you're interacting with, because those people need to have access to whatever definition you might hope they would have. If you want to be seen as a teacher and you're in a society where there are no teachers, then you will not, that cannot be your identity. Um, to choose a more, I guess, relevant example, um, if you have a definition in the United States with your political party and you go to another country where those are not very well known, most people around the world generally know who the American president is, but often don't know what party he belongs to. And that is a very big source of identity within the United States, your political party affiliation. But according to G, that cannot be part of your identity in another country if the people there don't recognize what those are, right? If they've never heard of the D or the R, then that cannot be your identity in those countries or in those societies, okay? Um, so I lived in Japan for most of my adult life, and in Japan, blood type is a type of identifier, sort of like your astrological sign is in the US. So even if people don't believe it, they know that other people believe in it, and they know that people talk about it. It's something that you can have a conversation about, even if you're not very familiar with like the content of each category. Um, and what's very important to understand about G's conception of identity is that fact about you does not change wherever you go in the world. Your blood type doesn't change if you go to Japan or you leave Japan, but it becomes an identifier when you're in Japan, and it stops being an identifier when you leave, unless you're in another country that believes in it as an identifier. So in the US, I still have the same blood type, but it's not part of my identity, right? Because as G says, it doesn't define me as a certain kind of person in the United States, okay? So that's a very important distinction to grasp. It's not what's true about you, it's what other people see about you or know about you, okay? Um, this is pretty much what I just said, but with a little graph. So this explains what the content of those categories are supposed to mean in Japan. But if you ever, I guess some of you might have students from Japan if you're ESL teachers, but if you ask them what their blood type is, they might have like this list of supposed characteristics of people with their blood type, and this is what they're referring to. And people in Japan are often surprised that Americans don't know their blood types, um, much like you might be surprised if someone knew their birthday but didn't know what sign that fell under, right? So G further breaks down his definition of identity into 4 categories, and I'm just going to go over the 4 categories next. This is where most of the structure of the assignments that I give my students comes from, these 4 categories. So the first one is nature, or N identity for short. You see G's definition here, and he talks, it's a little bit confusing to me the way he talks about N identity, because he makes it sound as if what's true about you is your N identity. But keep in mind that the definition of identity from the first page holds that other people have to recognize it in you. If there's a category of if there's something that's true about you that comes from nature, that comes from your genes, that isn't necessarily an identity category, keeping in mind the, you know, the blood type from the last slide. And then also, if something is true about you, different societies will categorize it differently, right? So being from a particular we would probably call them sub-ethnic groups, I guess, but within Nigeria, being from Igbo or something, being an Igbo, I think it's pronounced Igbo, is an identity that's available to people in Nigerian society. And that, to the extent that people believe that to be born to 2 parents from that ethnicity makes you a member of that ethnicity, then it fits the definition of an identity. But if that same person who's born to Igbo parents in Nigeria moves to the United States, that's not an identity anymore, because people don't recognize it. People don't know what it means. And I assume a lot of us in the audience us, you guys in the audience, will be social constructionists. It's not a brute fact, um, although it might have some, genetic force that forces the categorization within that society. The genetic force does not create the categorization, right? So N identity is the categorization. It's not the gene itself, right? I hope that was clear. I mean, I assume you guys will shoot me an email if it's not clear. This isn't live, so you can't like raise your hand and stop me. Maybe you are raising your hand now, but I can't tell. So let's just move on. I identity is the kind of identity that comes from a social institution. And a social institution is one that's made up by people of other people, like a university, like a city, like a government, like a company. And if your institution, if your identity depends on that institution, then G would call it an I identity. So you could be, for a lot of teachers describe themselves as being sort of teacherly by nature, and they might think of themselves as having an identity as a teacher, like I was a born teacher or something like that. I just love teaching or something like that. But unless someone hires you and gives you the title of teacher, gives you a business card that says teacher or professor, assistant professor, et cetera, lecturer, that's what I am, then that's not an I identity, okay? So you don't have the I identity unless an institution gives it to you, regardless of whether you think you were born to do it or not. So it's interesting trying to think of the I identities of different kinds of things that people can make money for. For example, we might say Kim Kardashian is an influencer and that's her job. It's hard to say whether that's an I identity or not because I don't know what institution gives her that identity. There might be a different identity category that might fit it better. Someone like me who's an employee of Southern Utah University clearly has an I identity, but there are a lot of people in the world for whom this, let's see, it's a little harder to identify them as having an I identity. That sounded tautological. Let me just move on. Forget the last thing I said. So a D identity is sort of the net that catches all the things that don't fit into the other identity or identity categories, because a D identity is just what people call you without attributing it to nature or an institution or the last category, which will be on the next slide. So if these two, the men that I've had on the screen for the last couple slides, because they're twins and they're also clearly employed by branches of the government, if I call one of them friendly and the other one kind of a poser, and I don't attribute that to their nature, and I don't attribute that to being employed by different branches of the armed forces, then that's just a D identity. So it comes from the discourse of other people, okay? So you might have, I don't know, if you're like me, you probably are thinking of the weird exceptions to these categories. And one of them might be, for example, if you're a prisoner, is that an I identity, is an N identity? A lot of people talk about the word criminal as if it were an N identity, as if it were just something you were born to be. But if you are imprisoned by, the state of Utah and you have an identification number and a cell and all of that, that's definitely an I identity. And so the two men that I talked about earlier, I said one was friendly and the other one was a poser. The one who's friendly might actually try to affirm that identity through his own actions, and the guy who I called a poser, and we don't know which one I was talking about, but that one probably doesn't want that identity, but identities can be imposed on you because, as G said way back on the introductory slide, identities are in the eyes of the people who are viewing you. So you can try to have them categorize you a particular way, but you won't always be successful. And contrarily, they might give you an identity that you never wanted and never sought, and in some cases are based on incorrect information or misunderstanding or prejudice, etc. So G takes pains to point out that I identities and D identities can be passively ascribed to you, even if you didn't want them. And that's not necessarily true of the next category, which is A identity. So the A stands for affinity, and it means being a member of a group with, let's see, a group that comes together because of their affinity for something and then takes part in practices that bind them together. So the example that I usually give my students is a Facebook group. If you're a member of a Facebook group um, like axe throwing in Cedar City or something like that, I think that's a real group in my city. Or fans of the death metal band As I Lay Dying or something like that. You're grouped with these other people because of your shared affection or affinity for this topic, and you take part in certain practices like starting threads, posting videos, etc., that mark you as a member. And that kind of identity, the identity that you have as a member of that group, is your A identity. Okay. Um, G uses the example of being a Trekkie, which I think is a good example too. But as with a lot of different things, the internet forces us to look at a lot of these old categories in sort of a new light. Anyway, so those are the four categories. They were NIDA, nature, institution, discourse, and affinity. So why should you care about this new concept of identity? So our students in ESL almost always have experience living in other countries. That means they have experience being defined by the categories available in other countries. And they're, in my experience, they're all familiar with the experience of having an identity ascribed to you that you didn't want, didn't earn, seems to come just from the mind of the person ascribing it, and then is shared by thousands of other people, and you don't understand why they all have that same identity in their heads and why they've just decided to affix it to you based on, I don't know, based on what you look like and where you're from. And G's conception of identity sort of helps explain this, because it allows identity to be something that is in the eye of the beholder rather than something you carry around with you. And if you're an international student, whatever you know about yourself you might not be able to realize it in a new society. And to a large degree, that's mediated by your language ability too. When a new student from Guangzhou, who's known as sort of an athlete, gets off the plane in Las Vegas, he is often very quickly judged by the other Americans in Las Vegas, and then especially when they get up to Cedar City, as being a certain kind of person that had nothing to do with what they believe is true about themselves. And I think G's idea of identity helps explain this process. So moving into the second half of this presentation, the lens for me is mostly for academic writing, and that means I have a few essays that use this lens, where they have to use the lens in a particular way, and then a lot of assignments that sort of lead up to that essay, or they're designed to help students brainstorm and hash out their ideas and allow me as the teacher to make sure they really understand the lens. But the three essays are the three biggest assignments that I usually give that use this lens. So in my classes at SUU, I teach 6-week terms, one level below transfer, and it's actually 2 levels, but we have 2 terms per semester. So let's just say it's 1 level below transfer. I fit 3 essays into those 6 weeks. Now, if I were teaching a semester-long course, I might do this over 10 weeks or something instead of 6, give the essays a little more breathing room. And then I might take the second half of the course and devote to this lens, and the first half for other things. The assignments that I'm going to outline here are based on this idea of 3 essays in a roughly 6-week course, but especially the second and third essay. The title of this presentation said, Identity is a lens for text-on-text writing. So the final essay of my semester is always a text-on-text essay, and the second to last is always text on self, or I think it's called text to self sometimes. What that means is around week 2 or 3 in my classes, the students are introduced to the identity lens, and they have to read the article, G's article, where he describes it and defines it. And then they have to write an essay where they use the identity lens to talk about themselves. So they have to have citations and a works cited page, etc. But it's just the identity article. Okay, so they only cite the identity article, and that's the only thing in the works cited page. And the next essay, the third essay, the text-on-text essay, is not about themselves. So they'll take the identity lens from G and apply it to some character. It can be a fictional character or a character in a autobiography or biography. I usually stipulate that it has to be some kind of cross-cultural narrative. So a story about immigration, like House on Mango Street or something like that. And in the third essay, they're not writing about themselves at all. So I don't know if I'm explaining this well. So the 3 essays go no lens, then lens, text on self, and then with the lens talking about another book. In addition to the big papers, the essays, I give a lot of assignments that are sort of leading up to the essays, and sometimes are literally just the essays in a different mode, different modality. So the first assignment that I give around week 2 or 3 is reading the article, and I do that with reading circles. So one person only reads the article and then focuses on vocabulary, one person reads the article and then focuses on grammar, one person reads the article and focuses on connecting it to his or her own life, and like that. I can share the worksheets with you if you're interested in those, but I guess most of you guys know what literature circles are, but that's how I read almost any complex text in my class. So in the week before they start the second essay, so the second essay is the text on self essay. I'll have them make a presentation that's not very rigorous, but they just have to have at least one slide for each identity category, and then a description of some character's identity for that slide. So you see an example here of someone describing the D identity not of Robert Downey Jr., but of, sorry, no, not of Iron Man, but of Robert Downey Jr. And this student was actually pretty astute in pointing out that people could confuse Robert Downey Jr.'s identity with Iron Man's identity. So people might actually think that in real life, Robert Downey Jr. is exactly like his character of Tony Stark. And that can happen. Again, in G's formulation, identity is in the eyes of other people. So if other people think Robert Downey Jr. is quick-witted and snarky and intelligent, then that's his identity, right? I often will tell them in this presentation, they can write about themselves or they can write about any fictional character that they know of. And they usually like this, and very often it's a superhero, right? Also, in the run-up to the essays, I'll have them do blog posts that are often just on a single identity from the NIDA, or usually this is actually after all the assignments are done, but I will have a debate where I'll give them a given characteristic, and they have to decide whether it's an N identity or an I identity, or an identity or not, more often than not. So I'll, for example, give them the category of international student, and one side has to argue that that is an N identity, and the other side has to argue that that is not an N identity, and they both have to have good reasons for doing so. And that's often much more fun than it sounds, and the students get really into how they are perceived as international students. So usually the N identity group will say, students look at, other students, domestic students look at us and assume we were always like this. Like we were always sort of having a hard time. We were always, Chinese or whatever. Um, and that makes it, in their mind, an identity because they think we were just born this way. And the other group will say, usually, no, we got this identity through the institution of Southern Utah University. They gave us the identity of international student. And that's why we go to international affairs. That's why our classes are picked by international student advisors, etc. If I had asked my students and had them sign like FERPA permission slips or something, I would be able to show you clips of the debate, but I can't. But it's pretty fun considering I don't know, the topic is sort of esoteric, but they always have fun. They always debate way more than they need to. I have requirements for how much they have to contribute to the debate, and they always go way over, like into lunch. Anyway, it's fun. But again, these are not the main assignments. What you see here, these are mostly to supplement the essays. So you want to give these assignments before you get to the essays, partly to iron out that they really understand the identity lens. The first thing I said about the identity lens is the trickiest part of it. The fact that it's not what's true about you, it's what other people think is true or what other people see. And that's the most common misunderstanding when people start using this lens to talk about themselves or to talk about other people. So you'll see this in their work. If they start saying things like, because he is intelligent, Tony Stark is able to understand technology better than the other Avengers, and they'll say both of those are an identity, or one is an identity and one is I identity. You can point out that they haven't really understood the lens. They haven't understood identity under G's definition, because it's not whether he's intelligent or not, it's what people see in him, right? It's whether people consider him intelligent. And it's only when people recognize it that it can be the foundation of an identity under G's definition. So the good example here is better, but not great. So this person is framing Tony Stark's characteristics as being in the eyes of other people, which is good. They're applying, they understand G's conception. And then the best example you see at the bottom of the page here is better because it intentionally applies the correct labels while it's describing Tony Stark's characteristic in the eyes of the other people who are giving him those identities, right? I also like the fact that they use scare quotes for the characteristics. So when you're describing someone's identity in the eyes of others, you don't have to take a position on whether they're correct. So when you say Tony Stark's identity is intelligent and you put it in scare quotes, it makes it clear that you're not taking a position, you the writer are not taking a position on whether he's actually intelligent or not. And it's not relevant. What's relevant is whether the other Avengers consider him intelligent and treat him differently because of that, right? These assignments that are building up to the essays are, in my classes, very often a good diagnostic for me to see whether they really understand the theory or not, the lens. There's some grammar, because we teach, ESL students, there's some grammar that is facilitated by this particular lens too. The main one that I see the most often is passive voice. So students want an efficient way to describe a character being seen as something without having to always put the agent in the subject position. They don't always want to say people see Iron Man as heroic and therefore they also consider him a hero or something like that. It's like too many words. It's wordy, right? So if they use passive voice, they can keep Iron Man in the subject position and say he is considered heroic, and they don't have to point out who considers him that way, right? The context will usually make that clear. So students also naturally want to hedge when they start talking about identity, because they're sort of, when they're describing how the other Avengers see Iron Man, they are referring to things that they say about him or ways that they act about him as evidenced in the movies, in specific lines or in specific scenes. So they can't necessarily make a strong claim that Iron Man is considered heroic. But they could say, Iron Man seems to be considered heroic based on this evidence. And I don't usually tell them that they have to hedge on a claim like this, but they tend to naturally want to hedge because they're not sure what's in those other characters' heads, but they have some evidence for it. It's not complete evidence, but it's some evidence, and they tend to want to express that in their writing too. And that's where hedging often comes up as a topic in class because students want to hedge. They want to say they're not sure what Black Widow thinks of Iron Man, but based on this one thing she said, it seems like that might be true. Okay. An issue that I often have to correct in my students' writing is when they use factive verbs to show what's in other people's minds. And if you don't know what a factive verb is, it's a verb like know that asserts both what other people think about something and whether that thing is true. So for example, if I say, people believe that Scout is a girl, I, the writer, am not taking a position on whether she's a girl. But if I say people know that Scout is a girl, I'm taking a position on that proposition. I'm saying it's true. That's part of the definition of the word know, is that it also asserts that its complement is true, right? So you tend to want to avoid this when writing about identity, because if the identity is the topic of the paper, whether or not that's true is irrelevant, right? What people think is the point. So you want to avoid factive verbs like know, because as the writer, you don't want to take a position on whether they're correct or not. And whether they're correct or not should not be your focus, right? So affectivity is sort of an esoteric idea within linguistics and definitely within the ESL classroom, but it's very often comes up in my classes when I use this lens, and specifically for this reason, because you don't want to die on the hill of whether Scout is a girl. You want to die on the hill of, you don't want to die at all, but if you're going to die on a hill, it's the one that people treat Scout a certain way, not whether she really is that way. Okay. So on to the essays. So I said I will give 2 essays that use this lens, one that's text on self and one that's text on text. This is the second essay of 3 that I give. The first one uses no lens, and this is the second one where they've read the lens article and they're just talking about themselves. So I'll give usually an essay that's like one of these 2. They just have to describe between 2 and 4 of their identities. 4 is the maximum, obviously, and give a thesis that ties them together somehow. And this is probably the easiest kind of essay to write, especially if you don't require that the thesis really makes a strong claim in addition to just describing the identities. If you haven't read the 3-story thesis, if you look that up, that's what I'm talking about when I say a strong thesis that ties them all together. If you're just looking for a 2-story thesis that makes an argument of some kind, then this is a pretty easy kind of essay to write. It's really more an essay that you would use to teach essay structure rather than to grade on content. The second essay is a little more interesting. So compare 2 of your identities from the same category in different situations or at different times. And this one requires them to understand the concept, the identity lens, in a lot more detail, because they have to look at 2 identities that are both n-identities and say something meaningful about the similarities or differences between them. And the first essay here, you can write a good descriptive essay of your NIDA identities if you still have the misconception that you just have one N identity, for example. So the first essay here is much simpler to write. So I have some sample theses for these kinds of papers. Actually, this descriptive essay thesis is pretty good. This is, I think, a 3-story thesis because it makes a claim about the connection between an identity and the other types of identities. The comparative essay here, this is a really good 3-story thesis. It's almost too big for probably this kind of essay. Like I said, I give this essay in the middle of the term. So if this student is trying to show that interpretation of nature depend on culture, it sounds like a much bigger essay than what I'm asking them to write. But I don't know, I might ask this student to pare down the ambition of their thesis a little bit. But these are what I'm generally going for in assigning these kinds of essays. Both of these would be probably A's, assuming they, supported them well. So the second essay that uses the lens is always my last essay of the term, and it's usually due like during finals week. So I'll ask them to compare and contrast either two identities by one or more characters from a novel or biography. So they might take the N and I identities of two different characters and compare those sort of, block or point by point style. Or even one identity at different times or in different contexts for one character. And often I'll give a pretty open-ended prompt saying choose some number of identities and some number of characters and say something meaningful about identity from your comparison. If the class, I think, wouldn't do well with that level of freedom, I might put it on rails a little bit more and say choose one character and talk about two of their identities, sort of like the comparative essay for the text to self essay, except in the text-to-text essay, of course, they have to talk about a fictional character or a real-life person who's written a biography or autobiography, and they're not talking about themselves, right? A big part of what makes the text-to-text essay harder is just the fact that they're not allowed to talk about themselves anymore, and I think that's true, regardless of the lens that you use. So these are some theses that I've actually had in my classes before, and I'm not giving you the students' names or anything, and these essays aren't about the students, so no FERPA violation. So the first one is from an essay about farewell to Manzanar, where they had to compare, I think it was one identity in two different contexts. And I think in this essay's case, I also told them they had to choose inside the internment camp and outside the internment camp as their two contexts. But this character ended up saying something pretty interesting about the character of Papa, who, if you read the book, he changes sort of from this scary authority figure to a kind of pathetic figure by the end of the book. And I think this student actually pointed this out, but it's arguable that at the beginning of the book, his characteristics of being sort of a loud and scary authority figure are more of an I identity within the context of the family as an institution than a D identity. By the end of the book, it's definitely a D identity, if only because he doesn't have that role. His existence as a pathetic figure doesn't really depend on the family anymore. That's a little sad to say, I guess. But I mean, that's true. If you haven't read the book, very little of this is going to make sense. It's an interesting book. I recommend you read it. And then, so this second person wrote their essay about Captain America, and I think I must have had a little bit lower standards this term because normally I ask them to read a book, not watch a movie. But still, they said something insightful about Captain America's identities. So most people don't know that Steve Rogers and Captain America are this. Do they? I don't think they do. Know that Captain America and Steve Rogers are the same person. Or maybe it's not relevant because he's a government employee as Captain America anyway. But anyway, so in the public's imagination, his superpowers are part of an N identity. But for the people who knew him while he was getting his superpowers, and mostly as a guy named Steve, they're a D identity because they don't attribute his powers to nature. People who only know him as the blue guy with the shield attribute his powers to nature. Anyway, so those are some example theses. Here's a whole paragraph, and I have asked this student for permission to reprint this here. So this student was writing about To Kill a Mockingbird, and the interaction between Tom Robinson's N identity and D identities. And let's see, you can read the paragraph, pause my presentation if you need to. But basically, she's arguing that his N identity, in some sense, fixes his D identity to certain possible outcomes, right? So he can only be seen as certain kinds of person given the N identity that he had. And I mean, if you're not familiar with the book, he's a Black man living in a fictional part of, I think it's Georgia, no, Alabama, it says right there, in the 30s. And, you know, this was in the one of the worst periods of the caste system in the United States. So, you know, what position you were born into affected how people could see you, what jobs you could have in like virtually every facet of your life. And the students really just pointing out that, I think, what do they say? Like his status as a guilty criminal, although he does have a trial during the book, his status as guilty does not depend so much on the discourse of other people as on being born as that particular kind of person in that society. Anyway, so I don't know how long that went on. I might have to trim some from this, but I hope you found it useful. If you're going to assign this as a lens, as something to explore with your classes, the article that G wrote in which he defines this whole lens is available for free. So I recommend everyone read it. I think it's really interesting, even if you don't use it in your classes. What did I put that second citation for? I didn't use that in this presentation, but that's interesting too. The third book is where I first heard of, is it? Yeah, is where I first heard of this identity lens. And the books by this author are all very interesting too, although they're mostly about teaching English in Japan. So I guess you will have my email address. I probably should have given it to you at some point. It's Mark McKeno, no space, no period, @ suu.edu. If you want to talk about this, you have questions, or I don't know, you want to get some ideas for how to use this in your classes, please send me an email. Bye.